Welcome to the Bowery Gallery. Thank you for coming. I'm Rachel Siporin, and I'm going to speak on the paintings and aquatint and etchings in Murals in the Marketplace. I'm delighted to be able to share the space with Iris Osterman, whose large paintings and also small works are brilliantly painted and very passionately felt. And one of the things that has been great about showing with Iris is that although our work seems on a kind of superficial level looks different, in terms of subject matter, but I do think that there is a closeness that we have, an affinity that we have in terms of the paintings being emotionally charged. I think my work is emotionally charged. I think that Iris's work is emotionally charged in that we tend to work from a subject matter that's very personal to us. So I think there's a commonality there. And I also think that the kind of gesture and mark is something that we share in the paintings. I won't talk anymore about Iris's work. I know she's reticent about talking about her work, but if she was here, she's stuck in traffic. I was going to ask her some questions. But so I just want to give you some background on the project. My father, Rachel Siporin, was born in 1910 and died in 1976. And he grew up in Chicago. He was a poor kid, the son of Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants. His mother was from Poland, and his father was from Russia. And he kind of started the 4 generations of artists in my family. His mother, Jenny Siporin, was a very talented, trained artist who actually, I don't know if she would have been painting otherwise, but she was always looking over my father's shoulder and saying in Yiddish, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you change this? And he said, well, Ma, if you have all these ideas, why don't you paint yourself? So he bought her paints and she painted, and that started the 4 generations of artists in the Siporin family. I think of my father really as the first. So his work, he first became known for drawings he did about the Haymarket incident, an early historical event that started was a beginning of the labor movement, and there was a lot of police violence in the incident, and he did these pen and ink drawings that were first published in New Masses, and that's how, he was very young, he was in his early 20s when he did this. After that, he was on the WPA, the Works Project Administration, and he was a muralist, a fresco painter. Now, it's hard to know how the fresco painters from the WPA really got a sense of how to paint frescoes, because some studied in Mexico, like I know Philip Guston studied in Mexico with the Mexican muralists, and I think he was already painting murals, but got some technical information. But I know that my father I really don't know how he knew how to paint the frescoes. His first frescoes were painted at Lane Technical High School, and they're still there. My son Michael and I, in 2016, we went on the Rachel Siporin mural tour of the Midwest, and enjoyed seeing his frescoes in Lane Technical High School, which were about music and art, and the kind of teaching of music and art. He then, when he was about maybe 27, he got the award. You'd have to compete, you'd have to do a study that had it very, very detailed what the fresco was going to be like, using historical information. And his first post office was Decatur, Illinois, and it had a lot about Illinois history. I know that there's a panel with Abraham Lincoln, and you know, it's historical. And his last fresco was painted with Edward Millman, a friend of his from Chicago, who was a muralist as well. And they painted, it was the largest, it was a competition that the Treasury Department funded, the mural cycle. And they got $30,000 for 2 years, which was a huge amount of money at that time. And I think it was the largest competition prize that murals got in nationally. And so during that time, when he was working on the St. Louis Post Office, which was between 1939 and 1941, right at the end of the Depression, going into the, you know, before the war, he took 2 trips to Mexico with artist friends, or met Mexican artists in Mexico and traveled with them. And I had never seen photographs of the trip. And in, I'd say probably 2019, but it was before I knew that my father was going to be included in the Vita Americana show at the Whitney, which explored how American art was influenced and American artists were influenced by Mexican murals. For some reason, I asked my sister, who lives in the house we grew up in Newton, Mass. My parents bought the house in 1957. And so I asked her if she had ever seen any photographs from my father's trip. And she said, you know, no, I've never seen them. So she goes up to the 3rd floor. She comes down with these negatives and she goes, I think maybe these are them. And these negatives, my father was a war artist in Italy and North Africa. The negatives were stored during that time, maybe in his parents' apartment in Chicago. And then my parents got married after the war. They lived in New York. They moved to Boston. They moved to this house, the house in Newton that my sister lives in, that we grew up in. And all that time, these negatives were just sitting there. And so, you know, it really was a gift because my father died in 1976. I was 22 years old. And, you know, to have these, I had them scanned, and the clarity, there were a few dark ones, but the clarity was not to be believed. And that launched the project. It was, I mean, I really felt like I was spending time with my father, and there were a lot of characters that he would describe that I never knew for some reason, even though quite a few of the artists that he would talk about were living like in Woodstock, New York. I never met them. I just would hear, they were on, you know, he would talk about Eddie and Julio and Ref, Anton Refugee, Julio Di Diego, Edward Millman. These were all friends of his who were artists. And, you know, I would hear about these stories, you know, but I really hadn't met them. And so finding and looking at these photographs and the scanned images was just, I mean, it was like a book I didn't want to end, a novel I didn't want to end. But that said, the work is inspired by the photographs, but they're figure compositions. They're not, there's no composition here that looks like the photographs. I mean, I would say some of the poses are in the photographs, but everything is kind of reconfigured to make a figure composition. So I wanted to talk about my process of working. And, you know, I have a sketchbook, which I brought. And a lot of times I start by drawing with ink in my sketchbook. But one of the things I was remembering that I had forgotten about was that most of the etchings, there was no drawing for. I just started drawing on the copper. And how many people in this group have worked with intaglio prints? So I was going to talk a little bit about the process, but I'm going to talk about it when we go over to the other location, where I'm going to talk about a print in particular, maestro and audience. But for most of the time, like let's say this etching right here, I'm going to compare the etching murals in the marketplace with the later painting. And when I started this etching, I didn't have a drawing for it. I just, started working on the etching. And because most of the etchings have 4 different states, which means you use a copper plate, you put a substance on it, which has asphalt in it, and you brush it on, it dries on the plate, and then you start to draw with a metal stylus on it. So after I would do the first state, I would etch it in ferrochloric acid, and then I would print it. I'll talk more about the printing process. So that allowed me to look at the print and then build it from there. But there was no drawing for this, and there was no drawing for this print either. I kind of built them as I was going along. But for the paintings, I did start with a drawing. So this etching, it's an etching in an aquatint, has almost all of them have about 4 states in them. And there was a certain amount of invention. In the photographs, the artist went to see the murals, but there aren't really any photographs of them looking at the murals. They're kind of, sometimes at a particular site I'll see art or sculpture from the period that they had gone to see, but they're basically picnicking and falling in love and drinking beer and having a great time. And so and my father's not in any of these pieces. He's not really in many of the photographs because he was taking the pictures. So in a lot of the etchings, I either included a Diego Rivera mural or portion of a mural, completely out of context. And sometimes there was actually Diego Rivera. I placed Diego Rivera in the etchings. They didn't need him. I think he was probably, in 1939, I think Diego Rivera was probably in the US. He might have been in California at that point. But because I was imagining things from my father's point of view, I imagined, that Diego Rivera would be there because he was such an influence. And so this etching is called Dreaming of Diego, and there is part of a Diego mural behind the figures. So the paintings are painted in flash, which is a paint I've used for over 20 years. And I've also, during that time, painted in oil on panel, usually panel, not on canvas. But I do love the color that's available with flash. It looks like gouache, opaque watercolor, but it actually dries in a way that's very, very solid, because it was originally used in the 50s by sign painters. And so it's got a very kind of, even though it looks like a matte surface, almost like a delicate surface, it's actually really tough, So, okay, so the painting murals in the marketplace. This was a drawing that I did for the painting before I got started, imagining, and when I mentioned that the paintings are constructed, there must be about 6 different references of the image. You know, there was a marketplace image that had shadow and that had this big tarp hanging like a ceiling. But then the figures were, you know, really taken for their pose out of context where I wanted them to be. And this drawing is, it's a different format than the painting. It's more of a square. I started the painting, but I did have a different format. This is more rectangular, more vertical. And later, as I was working on it, I did another drawing of the composition. And I remember years ago, a teacher of mine recommended drawing a painting while you are working on it and how helpful it can be. And I remember him saying, you know, you can draw what you want it to become, or you can just draw it the way you see it, and in the process of it, it'll become clearer what you want to do, you know. And so this was a drawing that I did while I was already working on the painting, and you can see that the format is the vertical rectangle. That I mean, it's kind of a square vertical. It's not like a real skinny vertical. But you can see that the elements, the figures were there. So I wanted to mention that one of the things that that really governs my color choices, all the photographs, of course, were black and white. And for whatever reason, I have no difficulty at all inventing color, and that the color really works in a completely different way, is governed by a different set of criteria. And the biggest factor is the color ground that I paint the paintings. So in this case, you can see, and I like it to be able to be seen, even if it's in small bits. You see this kind of, it's kind of like a cadmium orange peeking through here, and you can see it just peeking through in different places. And the color ground really determines my color choices. Everything responds to that. So the magenta here really governs the whole light in the paintings, and as well as the oranges. You know, they just, when I put color down, it's always in response to what the color ground is. So there are recurring figures in the paintings. Julio is this guy here with the pipe. He was, I mean, was a very extroverted guy, and he was in all the pictures. He took every opportunity to take off his shirt. You know, he was photographed many, many times in different positions, etc. And he was traveling with this woman who was his girlfriend at the time, but Julio had many girlfriends, and in fact, in the 1940s, he was married to Gypsy Rose Lee. There was a Life magazine article with photographs of them. But he was traveling with this very beautiful woman who became my muse in many of the paintings. And she just had this kind of grace and poise. And she's here. She's here. You know, she appears and reappears many times. Some of the images that I painted from were inspired by these little black and white postcards that my father bought when he was in Mexico in 1939. And this is one of the paintings that was inspired by one of these little postcards. But the way I worked, I don't know if you remember the movie or have seen the movie blow up. But do you remember he looks at this, and I don't actually know how he enlarges it. I guess he enlarges it in the studio as opposed to what I did on my computer. But I would find these kind of incidental characters in the photographs. And in fact, I would say in this painting, you know, a lot of the images, the puppets and the family walking, were really tiny characters in the image, but I would find something and expand it, and that's where the drama would happen, you know. So that's definitely true in this image because it was a black and white postcard, and the boat was tiny in this turbulent water and sky. I did want to talk in particular, well, right now, as we're talking about the paintings, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask about the flash painting or the images, the construction of the paintings? We'll move on. Oh, yeah.
I noticed that she's barefoot.
Yes.
And I find that interesting because he's so dressed up, and I assume he has shoes on. So it like makes me wonder what her role is.
You know, that's a really interesting question. A lot of times, because I compose the paintings and I construct them with figures that I just want to be in the painting, there's certain things that are not important to me. Like, I think that's a very good question, you know, why is she
seems so
barefoot?
much less formal then.
Yeah.
She's just like breezing through.
Yeah, and so also in the images there's the kind of European dressed people.
Yes.
And then there's people in the market that were wearing more traditional dress. And I think she was seen completely out of context in another image, but I have used her here and here, and she's a figure that I just found very kind of enigmatic, you know, and I think more of the gesture, you know, that she's running out, you know, kind of into the picture. And in fact, and maybe this is true of when one works on figure compositions, but there's certain figures as I'm working on a painting that I identify with, and I would say that in the work, the person I identify with in the whole show is this girl running. I don't know why, but maybe it's the pose, maybe it's she's running, maybe it's a gesture that she's running into the painting, but you know, I don't think including the barefootness was something that was that important to me, but I also think it describes that she probably was more like a peasant girl who was, you know, running through, you know, and actually she was in a street scene, but she just right there, center, you know, kind of main character. And I did think a lot about this figure and this figure, you know, being parallel, kind of moving in the space,
yeah.
Even though she's kind of static, you know, stationary, I should say, not static. This was the last etching aqua tint that I did, and it's the largest. It's on a copper plate, oops, which I brought. This is the copper plate, and I buy the copper. This is not fancy copper. It's not heavy. It's not bought in an art supply store. It's bought at a roofing supply place in Branford, Connecticut. I say, could you cut up a whole sheet of copper into, you know, and I say the sizes I want, and then whatever left over I take. So, this is what it looks like. Now, I can't show you what the copper looked like in the different states. I can only show you what it finally looked like. So this is what it looked like. This is what the copper looks like, and this is the way it printed. So as you look at it, you can probably see some of the aqua tint, some of the shapes of the aqua tint that would print in different shades. Like, let's say this is a pretty dark value, and that would be over here. And that's what it looks like. And then you see some of the copper where it's white is an area where it doesn't have any aqua tint. It was always, I'll explain more how it's kind of, there's hard ground brushed onto the plate so that it doesn't print, but I'll explain that. So what I did was just to give you a sense of what this looked like as I was working on it. I did bring the states 1 through 4 to show you what that looked like, but this is the only one of the prints that I actually did a drawing from. And this is what the drawing looked like. Now, I can never, even with the paintings, I can never really stick to the drawing completely, but I think with the etchings, you know, I start working on it and it becomes its own thing. Like, for example, this figure isn't in it at all, you know. And I actually had at one point it was going to be Diego descending the staircase here, but when I started working on the etching, that's when the composition became more definite. And in fact, the composition was pretty much worked out in the first, I'm standing here so that I'm not, if I go like this, it's probably gonna be dark, so. So this was the first step. So what one does what happens with an intaglio print, an etching, an aqua tint, an engraving, is that what is incised into the plate is what prints. It's the opposite of a relief print. In a relief print, like a woodcut, what you cut away doesn't print. So what you do is, the first thing you do with the copper plate is you brush on what's called hard ground. I was saying that it's a mixture of asphaltum, and you brush it on, and it coats the plate. You wait for it to dry, and then you start drawing on the plate with a metal stylus, you know. And at a certain point, well, I decided to etch it and print it when I had the figures, you know, pretty much set. And I also, when I first started working, when I was in college, I did a lot of printmaking, but then I really didn't do printmaking for decades. And when I got back into it, at first I would find that the reverse image, you know, just as you could see, this is what it looks like on the plate, but then when you pull the print, it's the reverse image, you know. So at first, the right-left diagonals, I found very confusing to go from painting to printmaking. And I do use a mirror. I look at it because sometimes something needs to be corrected. It looks fine on the plate, but when you see it reverse, the perspective doesn't, the diagonals don't work. But I've gotten so used to kind of working back and forth that frequently I get confused. I'll look at a print, it'll be a counter print, which is a print of a print, which goes back to the way it looks on the plate. And I have to remind myself of, is this the counter print or is this the print? You know, it's like I've become ambidextrous in a kind of funny way. Yeah.
I was just wondering, as you work in your process, do you use a mirror to look at the plate as you're...
Well, I do. I have, you know, a big mirror, and and then once I print it, then I've got the print to go with, and then, but I still will hold it up to a mirror because you pick up things. But after a while, it works both ways. It's very mysterious. It's different than a painting where if you turn it upside down, you might notice different things. So this is the second, so this was the first state, just to review, first state. Second state. So then I liked where things were and I decided it's time to build things up. This was the second state. I'm supposed to stand in the light. So this was the second state, and this is a counterproof. This is a counterproof, and the way you do a counterproof is once you pull the print, which is always very exciting, you pull the print off of the plate, or sometimes I turn the plate over and then move the print from the plate rather than the plate from the print. Then you take the print and you put it down flat on the press and you put a piece of paper on top of it and you print it. And then you get like what it looks like on the plate again. And very frequently the counterproof is lighter, but it does not, some people have said, well, does it affect the image that you've printed? Like, does it make it lighter? Does it blot it? And I guess because the ink is really strong, the black ink is very, strong darks, it doesn't. So usually.
Do you have to put it through the press then when you do that?
Yes. Yeah, it's all through the press. I have a 750-pound Charles brand press in my studio, and I built a new studio in my backyard, and the press had to be brought up to the new studio, and I didn't have, I looked around for somebody who moves presses for art schools, and I could not find somebody who was, I talked to different people that have print programs, and I just really couldn't find somebody, so I had to get like movers. And it's amazing, the press got moved up the hill by it being lifted. It was pulled by the truck, but it was lifted ever so slightly. I really thought that it was going to be destroyed, but it was fine. Because the movers did not want to take it apart because they didn't know enough about the machinery to put it back together. So, but it's moved, it's perfect. I printed this in its new location, it was fine. So then I usually go with the third state. So this is the third state, and you can see, this is the third state, this is the fourth state. So the third state has the aqua tint on it. And the way I established the aqua tint, when I was in college, I studied with Michael Mazer, who's an amazing, he's deceased now, but he was an amazing printmaker, and he was a wonderful teacher, inspired teacher. And we used all kinds of material and chemicals that you should never use, like benzene. We were pouring benzene on the plates to wipe it off, but we had this thing called an aqua tint box, and you would put your plate into the aqua tint box. Did anybody ever use an aqua tint box? Yeah, and then you turn it on, and all this resin would fall, and then you would pull it out, and you put it on the hot plate, and it would kind of melt, like the resin would. Well, I don't have one of those. And so what I do is I just use a can of spray, paint spray. And I try to do it outside, and it's actually hard to get it to be even because the spray, it just can glob up, or you want to get these little tiny dots, like little tiny sprays. You don't want it to cover anything because then it's not going to print. You want these little spots. And so the first thing that I did before I sprayed the paint on it was I took a brush, dipped in the hard ground, and I painted the areas that I did not want to paint. I did not want to print. So I painted as dried, and then I sprayed the paint on, and then you put it in the ferrochloric acid again. And the first etch you want for the lighter value, let's see if I can see where the lighter value would be. Like, let's say in here or in her dress, you know, where it's lighter, that would etch like maybe 5-10 minutes. Then you take the plate out, you rinse it off, and then you use the brush again to brush out what you don't want to get darker. And then you put it back. I did that about 3 times for the different values, but still, when I printed, a lot of times, all the work I've done with the different values, sometimes some things get darker than I would want. So what I do is then, the 4th stage is very important because, well, you can kind of see here the difference. Like, I did a little bit of burnishing, so certain areas that I thought printed a little too dark, I would kind of burnish, which is kind of, it's not a scraping tool, and actually aquatint is very easy to lighten, so I would make some changes that way, and then I put ground on it again, and then I would work on all these transitions, so they were kind of, I could move the value through. And so finally, this is a counterproof of the fourth state. Yeah, so that's the story. It's not, etching is not for the faint at heart. Any questions?
But those blacks and
Yes.
the darks, I mean, do you, it's pretty much what you sprayed down the first time. Is there any subsequent line or any kind of embellishment, like to build up those darks?
An area like this, no. Sometimes I want something, you see like in the chair,
Yeah.
you've got like a little lighter value and then you've got a darker value.
Yeah.
In certain cases, let's say in Diego's pants, there were 2 values there, but I might have lightened this one, you know, because again, it's really because of not what my planning was, but the way the little dots formed, you know, and so sometimes, or, you know, you can see the different values here, but a lot of what I did was building up some of the transitional values, so you see the marks here and here, but they help the transitions to work, you know, and yeah, now I could, you know, I'm not going to work on this print anymore, but I could decide I want to scrape out this, you know, and then, but it's kind of interesting because my earlier etchings, like in my show, my color etching show that I know some people here saw, I did a lot of scraping out of figures. These I really kind of worked with what was there. Like I worked additively. I was like, I don't like that. I can work with it, you know. I'll just draw over here or whatever. Yeah, so, and these 3 prints are, they're etchings without aquatint, and they are 4 states. You know, and in this print, there's a lot of what you call false bite. For some reason on the plate, I don't know really how it happened, but I liked it. That even though I didn't draw in this area, the plate, and there was ground on it, it kind of had what we call a false bite, like, you know. But I liked it. I like the kind of, you know, gutsy quality to it. And I think I think there's different directions in printmaking. And for me, printmaking is an extension of drawing, and so maybe that's why with the etchings, I usually just start drawing, because I do see it as an extension of drawing. Some printmakers are very process oriented, and they're like, you know, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna do this, and they want to print a whole edition. I don't have any desire to print an edition where every single print is the same. You know, I'm much more interested in having, you know, I mean, if it's black ink, I mean, the drawing's not gonna change, but I like each print to be a little bit different. So I'm definitely in the etching as draftsman camp. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, you said that you hadn't done printmaking for a number of years.
Yeah.
And when you picked it up again, were you conscious of any changes in your painting as a result of getting back into printmaking?
You know, I think when I first started printmaking again, I was really influenced because my older son Michael studied printmaking at University of Connecticut, and then he went to University of Georgia and got a MFA there. And I think just seeing him do the color reduction, woodcuts and etchings, he did a lot of lithography, he did etching, but he didn't do a lot of etching that was impressive. But I think it just kind of inspired me. And then when I got into the color reduction woodcuts and then the color etchings, I wasn't really painting. I was just kind of whole hog doing the printmaking. And this show is different because I was working back and forth. And you know, I can't say it changed the way I worked with paint. You know, I started painting and it was like the same kind of brushy way I always painted, and you know, I blocked things out, I kind of built up area. You know, the process was very much the same. I think though, what's different is the whole process with painting and the ground color and using flash. I mean, that's a whole other entity.
Right.
And, you know, and I have to say, I love both directions. Iris, I talked a little bit about your work. Just a tiny bit, just a tiny bit.
I'll be right back.
So, any other questions? Yeah.
Talk a little bit about this painting.
This painting. Well, okay. I'm glad you asked. So Diego's girlfriend, Julio's girlfriend, my muse, is here, and she's also here eating some kind of pastry and a picnic. So I composed this painting, and I'll show you the drawing for it. It's called Library, and there is a drawing for it. Which is let's see if I can find it. I think I'm getting close. I know this is really boring. Okay, here we go. So this was the drawing that I did for it. Okay, the ink drawing. And I guess, you know, I was looking at it, and I certainly saw some different elements. Like, I think when I started painting, I did make compositional changes in it. As I was painting, I made the relationship between this figure watching her and her kind of muse-like staring out, you know, more established. You know, in the drawing, it's these three figures, the male figures by the library, these two figures looking at a book, and this figure watching her. But I kind of brought up the drama in the painting. And I think the color is kind of quieter than in a lot of the other paintings. And again, the ground color was this kind of gray blue, and then that kind of set up the color for the painting. Did you have a particular question about it?
No, I'm just very curious about it, especially the gentleman with his hand on his hip
Yeah,
and what he might have been thinking.
I think, well, I imagined that he's watching her and that she's not aware, that they don't know each other, and that she's just not aware of his glance, but the space
You don't
is
think he's
charged.
giving her what for because he was angry with something?
No, I
That's what
think
I said.
it's more, who is this woman? Yes,
Thank you.
and sometimes the actors, like, I don't know till I step back and go, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. So it seems like in the paintings, there's a lot of, there's some like consistency in the color across the different paintings, like the purples in here you see in the purples in the other one, and same with the like sort of greens. What was there anything that inspired those color choices, or was it just?
Well, not the kind of consistency of the color, but I think that the color is all invented, you know, so it's really a response. I mean, I'm thinking of light source and light and shadow that was inspired by the photographs, but the actual color choices, it's really intuitive. And I think that the color, I mean, I think there's a kind of connection when there's a number of paintings that have this strong orange background, and I think those paintings have a kind of connection in terms of the color. I feel like this painting has a certain calmness and kind of closeness, more tonal color almost, that is different from the other paintings. Yeah.
This one here, Vanity.
Of the
Is that
picnic?
D? Yeah.
Well, that's Julio and the Muse, and they're picnicking, you know?
Yeah.
And there were other people in the photograph, again, you know, the composition was what it was, but I don't know, they're very engaged, but at the same time, they're not looking at each other,
Yeah.
you know?
Relaxed, and but relaxed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it looks kind of charged to me. But I don't know what.
I think so too. Yeah.
But there's an easiness about it, not they're comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's comfortable.
There's a sensuality though to the eating, you know, the sort of vibes between the.
Yeah. I feel like when I paint, I don't set out to create a certain drama. And then does that happen to you, Tony, when you're working with the figures or?
You put a figure here, you put a figure there, and all of a sudden there's something going on.
Right, I know the figures are facing each other, they're turned
You go that
away,
way,
they're, you
it's-
know,
You can't help but,
yeah,
draw conclusions.
yeah, I know, it's like, and then it just kind of happens and, you know. That also happens with, printmaking, like a lot of times, like when I pull the print, I'll think, you know, I'll see something that's there that I wouldn't see beforehand, you know, like sometimes a figure will look a lot like somebody, like a relative from like 40 years ago or something, and it'll be like part of your subconscious, you know.
That's such a weird thing when that happens.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't paint or draw figures that much, but I've done that, and it always kind
Yeah.
of is a shock.
Yeah.
You know?
I welcome it. I'm kind of amused by it, and
Yeah.
it's, you know, because it's like one sets things up, you know, and you might be thinking really abstractly, like I need to move this figure here to, you know, because I want, you know, this particular angle or this geometry, and then you realize there's this kind of drama that emerges that maybe was not something you were thinking about.
Sounds like a lot of
Yes.
fun.
Oh, this is a totally different question, but, you mentioned that your father knew the Mexican muralists, and, what was his name?
My father,
Yeah,
Mitchell Siporin.
Mitchell's.
My father, I don't know if he ever met Diego Rivera, because I kind of put Diego Rivera in the etchings, thinking about what he was thinking. He was traveling with American muralists, you know, like Edward Millman, who he did the St. Louis Post Office with, and he was also traveling with somebody he used to tell me about. He used to mention in his stories, but I had never seen a photograph of the artist Carlos Merida, and he's in a lot of the negatives. He was Mexican. He lived in Mexico, but he was originally from Ecuador, and he was an abstract painter, really interesting painter. And you know, I kind of pored over the photographs to try to figure out who I could, you know, imagine from photographs I'd seen who the people were. And there's some people I just couldn't figure out, but I did find a photograph of Carlos Merida just completely by chance, and I realized he was in a lot of the photographs, and that made sense because my father used to mention him. But I did feel and remember that my father would always say that, you know, Picasso was not his big influence, although he loved Picasso, but it was the Mexican muralists. And you know, it's kind of interesting. I feel like going to Mexico at that time in 1939 affected his murals, because the last mural cycle in St. Louis at the St. Louis Post Office, and luckily the murals are still there in Decatur, Illinois, and in St. Louis. They are more volumetric, you know, I feel like they were influenced by seeing the Mexican muralists, you know, in person. I feel like there was kind of there just seemed to be more volume in the figures. Not that the other figures in Decatur, Illinois didn't have volume, but I just felt like there was a difference. And then actually after my father finished the St. Louis mural in 1941, he enlisted in the Army because he wasn't married, and he didn't want to be drafted, and he enlisted in the Army so that he could become a war artist. And he was stationed in Italy and North Africa, and I feel like his work after the war was influenced by Italian painting. So I guess it all, you know, all the influences kind of come together.
The father of one of my friends was in Mexico and knew Rivera and Roscoe, and so that whole period interests me.
Yeah.
Is there a museum of murals in Merida, Mexico that you're aware of?
You know, I don't know, there might
Because I
be.
believe that when I was there,
Yeah,
it's striking back to me that there was a very substantial mural collection.
what, were they painted in that location?
I don't know.
Oh, because most of the time, the murals are on location, like there's a mural cycle and, you know, various public buildings.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming.
Thank you.